What about making your sound better?
Let's talk about snares in advance. I prepared this snare here, what I made several months ago, and we can use that to analyze it and decide what parts we need to resynthesize or what parts we need to make, because we have several ways to create snares or synthesize snares. The first way is to take a live acoustic snare and process it pretty heavily to find a way to create your own snare, what you want to achieve, like a punchy and heavy snare. This is one way. The second way is to, synthesize several parts of it you want to change. For example, if you want to change the bottom part, you only need to synthesize the bottom part, filter out the existing low end from your snare and, just put it in there and replace the bottom part. Or you can go and synthesize a full snare from scratch. And this is what we're going to do, obviously, but without hopping into it, we need to decide and we need to analyze this snare. This will help us to save time. We can decide what we need to do to reach that sound, what we are looking for. So let's take the bottom part first. It looks like a sine wave, but it is either distorted or saturated sine wave, or it is not a sine but a square wave or a filtered square wave, because in a sine wave we don't see these sailings and bottoms. A sine wave is more, smooth and even. This looks more like a square wave. But at the end of the bottom part, we can see that it is smoothens out and looks like it is filtered, like low pass filtered, or it looks something like that. So what we want to do here is use probably a square wave and apply a filter, a low pass filter at this part, to filter it out. This is the first thing. If we have a closer look at the very first part of the snare bottom, this is how I call the bass part or the lower part of the snare, we can see that it changes frequency, because if you see this wave, we can see that it is a lot longer and a lot lower frequency than this part, this wave or this wave. This is the transient part, let's talk about it later. So probably the bottom part has some pitch transient or some pitch bending in the beginning of the bottom, and this is what we're going to apply to our snare bottom too. This is what we need to know about how to synthesize the snare bottom. It is really not a big deal. So take a square wave, for example, or a distorted sine wave, or just some FMing kind of stuff, or an additive kind of sine wave. Let's apply a filter on the very end of the snare and apply a pitch bend in the beginning of the snare. So this is what we're going to follow now. The second thing what we need to do is synthesize this section of the snare. Now it is really hard to decide where the transient ends, because we can see that the bottom part starts here, but the transient starts here. It's pretty obvious, but we cannot really decide where it ends, so we will see. We will synthesize a clicky kind of sound for the transient, and we will decide what we need to do to make it work. So synthesizing a snare is really about, experimenting and trying and different things and fixing mistakes, because in most of the cases we run into like, okay, this is a good bottom, okay, this is a good transient, but somehow it will not fit with the tail, or the bottom will not match with the transient, and there are several issues you need to fix when you make a snare. It is the same when we create a new song, when we produce something. It's just a little smaller portion of it. This is only a snare, synthesized snare, but there are tons of ways to mess up your snare. This is the second thing. Now, obviously, the third thing is to create the tail of the snare, which, let's listen to it. It just sounds like a regular white noise, but it's not, because, white noises don't contain these metallic kind of content to the noise. A white noise is just a noise. You don't hear any metallic, high frequency, ear bleeding kind of tone to it, but it definitely has some. The other problem is you cannot really do anything to a simple white noise. Like, of course, you can EQ it, you can add different effects, but it will always sound just like a regular white noise. So we need to figure out something how to create a white noisy kind of thing, but also keeping that metallic kind of tone, because these snares always try to mimic the sound of a regular and acoustic snare, or at least, like adding layers. And most of the guys, when produce snares, they use like splash hi-hats or crashes and cymbals, and those always contain like a drastic amount of metallic tone. So somehow we need to synthesize a tail, like a noisy kind of thing, which also contains noise, and at the same time it contains some metallic content. And the last thing we need to see and apply is getting back to the transient and the bottom connection. We need to set some delay for the bottom part, because you know we have the transient and the bottom part starts a little later. So there are several things to apply this. If you use different channels, different tracks for the different parts of the snare, it's okay, you just push it away. Or if you use a drum rack or an instrument rack, you need to put a delay onto the bottom, you know, on 100% wet, and apply a few milliseconds of delay to it. And of course you need to pull back the feedback to 0, because you don't want to repeat your bottom. That would make some huge problems in the phases. So I think this is what we need to do. So this is the theory of synthesizing snare, and the first thing we want to do now is apply an operator, because this is what we're going to use to create all the content and all the parts of the snare. Of course you can use Serum or other synthesizer, for example FM8, but I experienced Operator is the best tool, because you know when you go to the oscillator tab you can draw in some harmonic content, which is very, very easy to do, and you can create some awesome sounds using that. Now the first thing I want to do is make a MIDI. So the snare bottom should be this long, for example, and you know a snare bottom always plays a little higher than a kick drum. So the main part should be at around F2, and this is what I'm going to do now. So let's choose an F2, and let's choose a square wave for that. So as I told you before, this is what we're going to do now. Now the easiest part will be if I delete or EQ out the lower part of my reference snare, and it will be very easy, you know, to decide if we are on a good path, on a good track to create a bottom part of the snare. So we now filtered the very low of the snare, of the reference snare. And this is obviously not a good snare now. And let's apply a filter now, as I told you before, but with some envelope. Push up the envelope a little and narrow the decay. Something like that. Okay, I think this will not sound bad. So right now let's apply a pitch envelope. And what I want to do here is push up the initial. This is what we're going to use to create some clickiness of the bottom part. And of course we are going to use a different click sound, a transient sound. And push up the peak to 24. This is going to be basically the pitch for the decay. And let's adjust the, oops, not the slopes, but the attack time and the decay time to achieve some pretty nice clicky kind of sound, some transient for the bottom part, what we are going to combine with the percussion kind of sound. But if you want to hear the effect, we need to push up the pitch envelope. Okay, this sounds pretty good. So let's add an EQ, because we still need to cut out some frequencies what we don't really like. Now, this is an interesting thing here, because most of the guys like to, and to be honest, I do it sometimes, to cut out the very lows of the snare. You know, you can see the peak here. Exactly at the E2 frequency, so it's around 170 Hz. So people like to cut the rest of the low frequencies of it, and it's cool. I mean, it works, but sometimes I experience that it ruins the phases of the snare, and somehow the overall result will not be as good as if we, you know, just keep the very lows. So we will see at the end, because, you know, I like to resample my sounds and analyze it if all the phases and everything will sound and look well. So right now let's leave the very lows, okay, because overall the snare, the bottom part of the snare sounds pretty well. And the next step, let's add some saturation, but before the EQ, because we are going to just, you know, cut the very highs what probably the saturator will generate. This is the snare button, what I wanted to create, and let's check it, how it sounds along with the rest of the snare. Now, it is not the best now, so let's try to adjust the starting point of the snare button. Okay, so adjusting the attack and the decay time on the pitch envelope, and adjusting the starting point of the bottom, and some EQing, and of course with the filtering, we was able to create a little harder hitting snare. Now, don't mind the transposing up, because you know, it's just the personal taste. If you like the higher pitch sound or not, you can go back anytime and, you know, use an F sharp, or what is the note we used, an F note, but I just like how it sounds 2 semitones up. And if you want to process further, what I like to do is add a multi-band dynamics rack, what I use, you know, to split the frequency up to 3 bands. Okay, that's it, 3 band split. And let's do some trick on the very middles, like at around 200 Hz. So I'm going to set the bottom split, which should be at around, well, 200 Hz. And the top split at around, I don't know, like 300 maybe, or 400, we will see. This should be good. Let's apply a saturation only on this section. So what I want to do is the middle part saturation. So let's drop a saturator to the middle part. Oh, we already have one, so we don't need to add another one. Okay, we boosted the energy on the bottom too. So I think this will sound pretty good now. And maybe what we can do is adding a drum bass, because I love Ableton 10 drum bass, but in this case we don't need the saturator to the end, just, you know, applying some transients and boosting the transients on the bottom part. Okay, it turns out that if we leave the middle high frequencies, it can create some very nice transients to the bottom part, what we can use up along with the separate transient, what we're going to make in the next video. So right now, I'm pretty satisfied with the bottom part. It sounds pretty well. So in the next video, we're going to synthesize the transient part of the snare.